The following video is a recording of a lecture from Genes to Galaxies, the 35th Professor Harry Messel International Science School, presented to high-achieving Year 11 and 12 students from across Australia and 10 other countries.
Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation and for this introduction. So what I would like to do is to try to convince you that it's very important to read On the Origin of Species now. And to do that, I will successively first remind you some important characteristic of Darwin's work. Then I will try to describe what has changed since Darwin's time, since Darwin proposed, the time when Darwin proposed this model, what are the new scientific results. Nevertheless, despite these huge changes, the last part will be, yes, you will not find in Darwin's book the present state of the theory of evolution. Nevertheless, it's very important to read this book, and I want to show you the reasons why it's so important to read it now, even if it's not the present state of the science. So, first point, just to remind you some important characteristic of Darwin's work. And the first one is that Darwin was not the first to propose a model of evolution. There were many scientists, many biologists who anticipated the idea that there was an evolution of living forms, of organisms. I just put some names here. For instance, the French biologist Buffon, who at the end of the 18th century was the first to suggest that the age of the Earth was probably more than 7,000 years. The value coming from the Bible, he proposed 100,000 years. It was nothing compared to the present age of the Earth, but it was the first step to show that the history of the Earth was far more important. And also he looked at the different animal species and he compared them, and he showed, for instance, that horses and donkeys were very similar. And he suggested that probably donkeys originated from horses by a kind of degeneration process. And he also considered the relation between men and monkeys. And it's interesting because he asked a question, are they related? And after a very long discussion, he says, they are very similar, but it's impossible. There is really an enormous gap between the lowest of human beings and monkeys. But you see already the question nevertheless was asked. So I also here showed Lamarck. You know that Lamarck was the first one to propose the idea of an evolution. But it was quite ambiguous because for Lamarck it was a kind of general process taking place every time on the Earth. So in permanence you have this movement of complexification coming from the lowest organism to the highest ones. So the process has not an origin as we think now, but the process repeats it permanently. The second difficulty of Lamarck was the mechanism of evolution. Lamarck considers that both there were an internal strength of evolution within organisms which pushed them towards higher levels of complexity, and also he considered that the environment and the will of the organism to adapt to the environment was another motor of evolution. Nevertheless, I think these authors were important to first suggest an idea of evolution of organisms and make this idea somehow popular. There is also, as you know, the grandfather of Darwin himself, who was a doctor but was very much interested in natural history, and also he proposed an evolution of organisms. The difficulty was that these mechanisms and the arguments in favor of evolution were quite weak. And I have mentioned here a book which appeared in England in 1840s. And this book was very popular, and it clearly stated that organisms were evolving. But when scientists, when biologists look at the book, it was a pure fantasy. Species transform one into the other, extraordinary transformation, something which was really not compatible with what was known of organisms. So I think you must understand that, in fact, the idea of evolution was already there. In the middle of the 19th century, many people consider that there were probably an evolution of organisms. But what was missing was true, serious arguments in favor of this evolution and a mechanism of this evolution. And that was what Darwin brought, more than the idea of an evolution. So, second point, just from which were the authors who influenced Darwin. You all remember that Darwin was trained in first in medicine, then in turn towards biology, but the decisive event in Darwin's formation was a journey on the Beagle, a 5-year journey during which he discovered a lot of phenomena which finally will constitute the basis of his theories. What was the intellectual influence for the formation of his theory of evolution by natural selection? The first one was Malthus. Malthus was an economist, and Malthus was the first to demonstrate, to show that in fact the number of individuals in a population increased faster than the resources accessible to this population. The work of Malthus was on human population. He was a demographer, an economist. But Darwin extracted this idea and adapted it to the natural world, to the world of organisms. But I think it's not the most important influence on Darwin's thinking. And the idea of Malthus was that so you have more and more individuals, the resources are not increasing at the same rate, so you have a conflict, and so only some individual will survive. And they are the best adapted. So Malthus had this idea, but Darwin adapted it, projected it on the natural world. But much more important than Malthus was the influence of Lyell. Lyell was a geologist. And Lyell, in fact, was not the unique one, but one of the most important actors in the revolution of geology. Two important transformations of geology. First, the extension of the age of the Earth. So now it was reasonable to consider that the age of the Earth was many hundreds of million years, maybe billions of years of age. Earth was a very old, had a very long story. But the second transformation was a mechanism. What were the mechanisms responsible for the transformation of the geology of the Earth, of the landscape of the Earth? And as you know, the principle of Lyell, which is called uniformitarianism, is the idea that you must explain the transformation at the surface of the Earth by strange processes still acting in the present world. So you must not consider extraordinary causes for the evolution of the Earth, but only refer to strengths you see here in this world active. For instance, the action of rivers, the action of the sea on the seashore, and so on and so on. All the things you can observe now were probably the causes of the past events which modeled the surface of the Earth. And the influence was very strong. First, as I will show you, because in fact Darwin worked first in geology. It was his first interest. And the proof is that Darwin took the book of Lyell and brought this book with him during the journey on the Beagle. He had the first volume of Lyell, and he obtained the second volume of Lyell in Montevideo in Uruguay during one of the stops of the journey of the Beagle. And the third important intellectual influence on Darwin was Milne Edwards. It was a French physiologist. The name is not French, but he was a French physiologist. And his idea was that during evolution of societies, you observe the complexification of the societies. The more a society is evolved, the more you have in societies different functions of individuals, many different jobs, everybody doing something different in the society. So evolution of society leads to a complexification with different functions of the different members of the society. And Milne Edwards was conceiving that it was the same during evolution of organisms. The more complex and evolved is an organism, the more different parts you have, the more different functions you have. And this idea was somehow shared by Darwin, and Darwin will use this idea to understand evolution, as I will show you later. So, second point I want to remind you is that the work of Darwin was a fragmented work. When you consider the different books of Darwin, you have 4 books which are considered as the basis of the theory of evolution, on the origin of species, but also the second book, which was more on the experiment done on animals in domestication, the third one, which was a book on the evolution of man, and the last one, comparison of emotion in man and other animal species. You know why, or I will remind you why the work of Darwin was fragmented. You remember that Darwin, after the journey of the Beagle, conceived quite rapidly, some years after, the idea that organisms did evolve and that the mechanism was probably variation and natural selection of this variation. As early as 1837-38, one finds in the notebooks of Darwin this idea. But Darwin wanted to bring arguments in favor of these 2 important statements, evolution and mechanism of evolution. And he collected a lot of data during more than 20 years. And his project was to write a huge treatise in which he would have put all the information he had collected. But it was not possible because in 1858, Darwin received a small paper from another naturalist, Wallace, which proposed a theory which was quite similar to Darwin's theory. The idea that organisms have spontaneous variations and that the best adapted organism will be selected, so they will reproduce more, and for this reason these variations will invade the population. So Darwin saw the danger. He had to write his theory. He had to publish a book. So in 1801, he wrote a kind of summary of his theory. It's on the origin of species. But it was a short summary, short, not so short, because if you know the book, it's already 500 pages. But nevertheless, it was not the book Darwin has dreamed about. So he had a lot of other elements he had not been able to put in this book, and these elements are now dispersed in the 3 following books. That's the reason why his work is somehow fragmented. Another important aspect of Darwin's work is that it's not the only contribution that Darwin did. I have shown here that he published some other studies on questions which are apparently unrelated to the problem of evolution. For instance, he did specific studies on the barnacles to classify the organisms, to study their physiology. He did some work on the insectivorous plants, on orchids and reproduction of orchids. He did a lot of work also on the role of worms in the formation of soils, on the movement in plants, and so on and so on. So Darwin was a true naturalist. And clearly the theory of evolution by natural selection of variants is, one might say, his most important result, but one must forget all these specialized work. And in particular, as I mentioned previously, Darwin was a geologist. And he did his first study were in geology, formation of atolls, the formation of mountains in South America, and the third book in geology. So one must forget this part of Darwin's work. Okay. Now it's also necessary to put Darwin's work in the context of this work. And there are clear limits in Darwin's work, limits due to the state of knowledge of its time. First limit, for instance, is that you don't find anything about microorganisms in Darwin's work. Darwin knew the work done by microbiologists, but in fact it was too early. If you think about the dates, progress of microbiology were done by the French and German schools of microbiology in the 1850s, 1860s. So sometimes they were contemporary of Darwin's work, but nevertheless they were not yet assimilated. Why is it important? Because if you consider today the theory, Darwinian theory of evolution, the best arguments in favor of this theory are found in the world of microorganisms. Because it's much more easy, the reproduction time is small, so you have time to have a lot of generation and you can observe transformation in vitro, for instance. Second limit was that Darwin was absolutely unable to explain the origin of variation. For the theory of Darwin, you need spontaneous variation and variation which will be transmitted to the descent. And these two statements, in fact, Darwin had absolutely no way to support them. What was the origin of variation? Darwin had no mechanism to propose. Now we know that it's mutation affecting the DNA molecule, but at that time, clearly, this kind of answer was not existing. So Darwin was only had to hypothesize the existence of this variation. He can show their existence, but he did not know the origin, the mechanism leading to this variation. And the last point, that for a theory of evolution by variation and natural selection, the variation which spontaneously appeared in the population have to be transmitted to the progeny, if you want the theory functions. And once again, there was no theory of heredity at the time of Darwin, when Darwin proposed his mechanism. You know that the first theory of heredity was proposed by Mendel. It was in 1865, so 6 years after the first publication of On the Origin of Species. And in addition, as you know, probably the results of Mendel were not known. And one had to wait the beginning of the 20th century for the results of Mendel to be rediscovered and really become accepted by biologists. So you see that there were a lot of difficulties for Darwin. He had a model, but he was not able to support this model and to really explain what happened, how the variation occurred, how they were transmitted to the progeny. So a lot of weakness coming from the state of knowledge at the time of Darwin. And Darwin committed, from this reason, some mistakes. In particular, as maybe you know or you don't know, because sometimes it's not said, Darwin tried to look for a mechanism of heredity. He considered that it was absolutely necessary. His theory was not possible if he had not a mechanism of heredity to propose. So he proposed a mechanism which is called pangenesis in his second book. This mechanism was in fact a mechanism suggested that different molecules coming from the different parts of the organism were circulating in the blood and brought to the germ cells. And in this way, the germ cells contain somehow an image, a chemical image of the whole organism. It was an old theory that, in fact, it was proposed for the first time by Hippocrates, so a long time ago in the antiquity. The problem with this model is it is in full agreement with the theory of heredity of acquired characteristic, the Lamarckian vision, that an organism can develops some of its organs, and this transformation can be transmitted to the progeny. Because if the molecules are sent from the different organs, consider, for instance, that you have an organism in which one organ was developed, this organ will send more molecules, so the progeny will have the same characteristic, for instance, more development of this specific organ. So somehow the theory that Darwin proposed, theory of heredity, was opposed to his vision of evolution by stochastic variation and natural selection. It was a conflict, but which somehow pushed Darwin in his last part of the work to give slightly less importance to his own mechanism and somehow to give more importance to a Lamarckian mechanism of evolution. And also another problem for Darwin, as I mentioned, was the origin of variation. Why spontaneous variation occur? And the simplest solution was to consider that it was a direct effect of the environment. And it was the solution that somehow Darwin adopted. Environment is responsible for this variation. But in this case, once again, the theory was somehow directed towards Lamarckism instead of the vision of real Darwinian vision. And so in the second part now, I want to show you all the things which changed since the time of Darwin. And there were different steps, in fact, from the model of Darwin to the present state of knowledge. The first was the huge contribution of August Weismann at the end of the 19th century, which really demonstrated that there was not an heredity of acquired characteristics. So if an organism has been transformed during his life, this transformation is not transmitted to the progeny. Weismann did some experiment to demonstrate this, but also it was a result of a clear separation introduced between the soma and the germen. So the part of the organism which is responsible for the function of the organism, and the part of the organism which is specifically involved in the reproduction. There is separation between the two parts of the organism, so it's impossible to have an influence from the environment transmitted to the germline. This was a very important, somehow, change in the theory of Darwin, or at least modification of the theory. That's the reason why it was named Neo-Darwinism. After the modification introduced by August Weismann, people spoke about Neo-Darwinism and not Darwinism. The second important evolution of the theory took place during the first decades of the 20th century. First step was the development of what was called the population genetics, theoretical models which allowed first to say exactly what was the fitness. This notion of fitness, better adaptation, was not so clear in Darwin's work, and this the work of population geneticists allowed to give a quantitative description of fitness. Fitness is simply the number of progeny, the relative number of progeny of different organisms. Second, these models allowed to show, to demonstrate mathematically that even if you have a small increase in fitness and a small selective advantage, nevertheless, if you have sufficient number of generation, you can show that you have replacement of one allelic form of a gene by another. So a demonstration that you don't need huge selective effects, or that you can have small selective effects and they are sufficient nevertheless to lead to a transformation of species. And this also, in fact, what was important in this work was to put together evolutionary theory and genetics. And this led to what is called the synthesis, the evolutionary synthesis, which was proposed by many evolutionary biologists in the 1930s. I have mentioned here only 3 of these important evolutionary biologists who contributed a lot to this modern synthesis: Theodosius Dobzhansky, Ernst Mayr, and George Simpson. Each of them had a different contribution. Dobzhansky was a geneticist. He had been working on Drosophila, the preferred organism of geneticists. And what did Dobzhansky was to show that in nature he was able to observe the same genetic effects than in the lab. So he transferred genetic knowledge from the lab to the nature, one can say. The second one, Ernst Mayr. Ernst Mayr, in particular, addressed a very difficult question in evolutionary biology, the formation of new species. And he proposed mechanism for the formation of new species. And George Simpson was a paleontologist studying fossils. And what Simpson did was to show that the fossils we have somehow are in agreement with the model proposed by population geneticists and evolutionary biologists. So there is no disagreement between models and observed fact. Modern synthesis is still the paradigm in which evolutionary biologists work today. So really, the present theory is the legacy of this emergence of evolutionary synthesis in the 1930s. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that nothing has changed since its time. And I have put here some of the more recent transformation of the theory of evolution. I don't want to go into the details, but just to give you some of the modification which occurred. For instance, an interesting modification is the introduction of the notion of strategies in evolution. If you have read some books on evolutionary biology, probably you have been struck by this idea of strategies. When evolutionary biologists consider evolution, they consider the strategies an organism have used to evolve. What was the best strategy, for instance, for this organism? They imagine some strategies, and after they try to check whether this strategy has in fact really been involved in the transformation they have observed. This is a very important transformation in the work of evolutionary biology. Second transformation, important transformation, is the accumulation of molecular data. It's important for at least 2 different reasons. The first is that it's the best proof in favor of the existence of evolution of organisms. Consider, for instance, one simple result, genetic code. Genetic code, correspondence between amino acids and nucleotides, is the same in all the living world, in all organisms. This is the best proof of the common origin of all organisms on the Earth. It's not the unique one, but it's, I think, one of the best proofs. But molecular data were also very important for other transformation of evolutionary theory. In particular, as some of you probably know, it was very rapidly noticed that the change at the molecular level is somehow regular. You have what is called the evolutionary clock. So you have a progressive divergence in the sequence, for instance, of proteins or DNAs. This molecular clock is very important for the classification now of organisms. It's the main tool on which this classification are built. But for the evolutionary people, it's a challenge, because traditionally it was not anticipated. If evolution is due to the action of natural selection, there is no reason to have this regular clock. So it led evolutionary biologists, and in particular the Japanese evolutionary biologist Moto Kimura, to introduce the idea that most variations during evolution are neutral. It means that they are not selected. Some of them are selected, but it's a minority. Most part of the evolution, at least at the molecular level, is due to variations which are not selected, because they are neutral. They have no real effect on the fitness and the adaptation of the organism. Just to mention some other recent results, transformation of the theory of evolution. You have heard probably about what is called EVO-DEVO, evolutionary development studies. It means that now people are interested by the transformation which can is mutation, variation which can explain the transformation of organisms. And the idea is that probably the main transformation occurred through mutation of a specific class of genes evolved in the control of embryogenesis and development. So transformation of organism is due to modification of this specific set of genes. Not uniquely of this specific set of genes, but nevertheless, modification of the genes involved in development had probably a major role in the evolution of organisms. But there are also other results. For instance, the result, and which now has been demonstrated in some organisms, that in fact the rate of variation, rate of mutation, is not constant from one organism to another. It can vary between organisms. For instance, an organism, when in a stress situation like microorganisms, will increase its rate of mutation, eventually because it can help to have rare mutation susceptible to allow the adaptation to these new stressful conditions. You have epigenetic modification, which are modifications which are not directly altering the sequence of DNA, but only altering the proteins interacting with DNA, and DNA but through modification which are reversible. And it's a big question now in evolutionary biology to try to see what is the role of this epigenetic variation in the evolution of organisms. So just this point to show you that the evolutionary theory has evolved since the time of Darwin. There are new results, new models, new hypotheses. And the conclusion is that Darwin was not Darwinian. It's a joke, but it's not totally a joke. In fact, what we call Darwinism today is not what Darwin said. And it's normal, because it's already 150 years that Darwin wrote this book, and science progressed since the time of Darwin. There are new results, new theory. And I think it's not a good thing to speak about Darwinism, because many people who don't know exactly evolutionary biology have the feeling that the question is still, was Darwin right, was Darwin wrong? It's not the question. Now we know that Darwin was right on some things, like the importance of evolution by variation and natural selection. We know that Darwin was wrong on some other aspect of his theory. But now evolutionary theory is not what Darwin said. It's a complex set of theories, models. And it's no question now in the work of evolutionary biologists to ask the question, is Darwin right or wrong? No, the question is, in this specific case of evolution, what is the mechanism which is the most important? Is it natural selection? Is it a natural evolution? And so on and so on. I had no time to describe all the results of recent evolutionary biology, but for instance, you have mechanism of gene duplication, chromosome duplication, and everybody knows that these mechanisms are important. So the questions are more specific. Consider also that it's curious because in no other science than in biology, people have given the name of a person to a theory. In physics, you have no Einsteinism. Look, it would seem unreasonable to call relativity Einsteinism. In biology, you speak about Darwinism. It's a paradox, but I think it's not a good thing, precisely because it does not show that science evolved and that now the state of the theory is not the state it was in at the time of Darwin. But the problem is that when one has a commemoration like this year, we commemorate Darwin, and a year of commemoration is never favorable to a true history of what happened, because people consider they have to say that Darwin was the one who was responsible for the present state of evolutionary biology, which is not true. Darwin did a huge contribution, but the present state of evolutionary theory is something different from what Darwin said. So the last part of my talk will be on, despite this transformation, despite the fact that there are plenty of new results, model theories in the time of Darwin, it's still very important to read on the origin of species. And so I hope that after this lecture you will rush to the library to read on the origin of species. But what I will help you maybe, because if you start reading the book, your first feeling that it's not so easy to read the book. The first, because it appears somehow disorganized book. You have the feeling that you don't see exactly where Darwin is going. You have a lot of repetition, you have contradiction in the book. So when you read it for the first time, it's not obvious immediately to see the interest. And I think this has to be explained. This book of Darwin was in fact a book which has been thought about during more than 20 years. So on the origin of species, Darwin does not propose a new theory. It tries already to refute the arguments of the people opposed to his theory. So it's a book which is constructed, but not constructed to say, this is my theory. It's constructed to already oppose the arguments which have been already addressed by his friends, his colleagues to his theory. So it explains why the book is somehow so complex and somehow difficult to read. Another aspect of the book, and when you have understood it, it makes the reading simpler, is that to really support his model, Darwin used a certain number of specific systems. For instance, he has studied the pigeons, the different races of pigeons. He had done a lot of work with breeders. And this example of the pigeon will be used again and again on the origin of species. I mentioned the work that Darwin did on barnacles, on orchids, and so on. All these studies will be somehow used as a specific experimental system on which Darwin will base his model. So it explains why so frequently in his book Darwin's come back to the same examples. They are the examples which are important for him to really support his model. Second, point I want to insist is that This is a characteristic of Darwin's book which strikes you when you read it carefully. On the Origin of Species is a book on the evolution of organisms in nature. But if you look at the book, you will see that nearly all the examples which support this evolution are examples coming from the action of man on nature. For instance, there is a lot of arguments brought by Darwin which come from the modification, transfer of plants from one continent to the other. For instance, transfer of plants from South America to Europe, transfer of plants from Europe to Australia and to other continents, and the acclimatation of these plants. Also, Darwin used a lot of experiments coming from the practice of the people, of the population, for instance, which have provoked the disappearance of one animal species or another, or the work of breeders. Nearly, let's say, 90% of the examples explaining or supporting the theory of evolution come from the human practice. It's surprising because the book Okay. I was wondering what that means. Okay, so most of the examples of Darwin come from the human practice, human action on nature. Although his aim is to study what happened in nature without man, somehow, without the action of man. It's somehow a paradox, but I think it's an interesting paradox because it demonstrates, which is not so new for people studying science, that science, production of knowledge, is always a result of the action of man on nature. Science is never the pure, simple observation of nature. It's always the result of the action of man, of transformation by man of nature. And it's a good example because I think it's not so free. In physics, it's evident. It's obvious that knowledge in physics comes from the action of man on nature, but it's not so obvious in biology. People frequently consider that biology comes from the observation of organisms. It's not true. It comes also from the observation of action of man on nature. So it's frequently said that on the origin of species, Darwin would have put aside maybe the most important question, the relation of man with nature. And it's also said that Darwin was very careful. He didn't want to really advance the idea that when man was a part of nature, that man evolved from other organisms for religious reasons. And so he would not have said anything on the relation between man and nature on the origin of species. It's not true. It's true that Darwin does not explicitly address this question. He does not explicitly look at the origin of man's relation with other primates. But if you read on the origin of species, it's quite obvious that man is a part of nature. Human beings are organisms like the other organisms. You must be very naive when reading on the origin of species. You don't see immediately the consequence that the formation of man was due to the same mechanism than the mechanism which drive the evolution of organisms. Another point also, you know that in selection, Darwin proposed in fact not one mechanism, but two mechanisms. Natural selection, which is due to competition between organisms, competition for instance, food. And the second mechanism is sexual selection. The best way for a new variation to expand in a population is only for the organism to have more progeny than the other. So, for instance, the strategy for organism is to have access to more males or females depending upon the sex. This is sexual selection. So sexual selection is only the way to attract the opposite sex, and in this case you have more progeny and you will win on the other organism. In fact, this idea of sexual selection, slightly different from natural selection, this idea is already present and is on the origin of species. Okay, here just have a long list, but I don't want to describe all the items in this list. It's only some of the things you will discover when reading On the Origin of Species. And you will discover that many of the discussion, many of the points I have raised previously, telling you these are new results of evolutionary biology, as they were not discussed at the time of Darwin, that in fact in the book of Darwin you don't find solution of this question. But Darwin already noticed some of these points, raised these points. And what occurred in the 150 years which occurred since the time of Darwin was an explicitation of this point, a development, but not in fact, Darwin had already the intuition of many of these important ways for the theory of evolution. For instance, the idea that many variations are neutral, you find this idea in Darwin's book. The idea that the rate of variation can vary depending upon the environmental condition, you find this idea in Darwin's book. The idea that development is very important to understand evolution, Darwin already suggests it, and so on and so on. You have here the list, but I have no time to enter into each point. We can discuss it. My argument is not that Darwin has already guessed everything. It would be the opposite of what I said before. But the book is very interesting because Darwin has seen some of the difficulties and maybe the way to solve them. He has guessed it. It will be developed in the future work, but nevertheless the book is very interesting for this very keen vision of Darwin and some of the future developments of his theory. I want also to emphasize some of the important aspects of the theory of Darwin. And an aspect which is not enough mentioned and discussed, I think. A theory of Darwin, idea of variation and selection, is absolutely a new way to explain facts. It's a scientific theory which is dissimilar, different from the traditional ways to explain in science, and in particular in physics. In physics, maybe you will not agree, but in physics I think there are traditional ways to explain facts. You can explain them with mechanistic models. It was the tradition, for instance, of Descartes. And you can explain also the facts by the existence of laws. You have laws, and so it's a way to explain the phenomena. The theory of Darwin is not a law. It's not a mechanistic theory. It's a different and radically new way to explain phenomena. And in addition, it's a way which is specific to organisms, which does not apply to the inorganic world. And I think it's a real difficulty of the theory, and it was difficult for people, for instance, physicists of the time of Darwin, to really accept this idea, new way to explain, and to explain facts only for organisms and not for inorganic objects. Many physicists say organisms are in fact objects of the natural world, so we must explain the organic fact by exactly the same principle than we explain what happened in the inorganic world. Another difficulty, there are other difficulties in the theory of natural selection. One of the points is that it's a theory which explains historical facts. It means that you explain facts which occur in the past and you are not able to reproduce these facts. So it's a difficulty because you have not the possibility to do experiment and to check what really occurred. Or you can do that in experimental evolution, but it's very limited. You cannot test all of the evolutionary facts. A second difficulty is the fact that you must explain in the theory of Darwin discontinuity, the occurrence of discontinuity with a theory which supposes the existence of a continuous variation. Darwin proposed the idea that variations were of a limited amplitude. Evolutionary variations are of a limited amplitude. Nevertheless, it leads to dramatic change in the forms of organisms. Consider, for instance, the formation of species, new species. It's a discontinuity. A new species occurs, it's different from the previous species. Nevertheless, the formation of a new species is due to small variations, progressive small variation. So you must explain discontinuity by continuity. And it's not easy. And a lot of work of evolutionary biologists since the time of Darwin have been to propose mechanisms to try to really explain how discontinuity can emerge from a continuous process. Also, another point is the problem of progress and contingency. In the theory of Darwin, some organisms are selected. So they have an advantage. They have a higher fitness. At the same time, they are selected in a very specific environment. So there is no clear criteria of progress in this case. It's a huge problem in biology. Is there really a progress in evolution or not? I just want to give you a small quote of Darwin where he discusses this point. As you can see, Darwin hesitates. So he considers that, yes, you have species which are probably superior to others because they were better in this competition, in the struggle for life, as it was said later. But at the same time, it's not clear that you have a real progress emerging from this competition. It's a question which is still actively debated in biology. How is it possible to somehow put together the mechanism of Darwin and eventually the idea of a progress? How two things can be put together? It's not simple. We can come back on this point in the discussion. Another point is the problem of competition, the struggle for life. What is the nature of the competition between organisms? The basis of the process of natural selection. Many times, one has a very rough idea of what is competition. You see competition as a fight for food, for instance. When you read Darwin on the origin of species, it's much more complex. Darwin tells you that, in fact, variation and the advantage of this variation, the adaptation it allows, is in fact highly difficult to understand. To understand it, to understand why a small variation provides fitness, you must consider all the interaction between organism and the environment. So it's highly complex. And the consequence of that is that it's many times impossible to tell why a variation leads to an increase of fitness. And it's the same when a species disappears by competition. If an animal species disappears by competition, it's also impossible to tell why this animal species has disappeared. Why was the disadvantage it had? You have a quotation here of Darwin telling that in many cases we can't understand why a species disappears or not. So it's a part of the complexity of the theory of Darwin. And another point I want to address, and this will be the last point, is the place of man in nature. As I mentioned, it's clear that man is a part of nature. Evolution of humans is a part of evolution of organisms. At the same time, Darwin considered that there was one unique human species. He discussed the problem of races in humans, and he showed that, in fact, there is absolutely no way to say how many races are there. So it means that the notion of race is not, in fact, a true scientific notion. But at the same time, it was difficult for Darwin to to really exclude natural selection from the evolution of human beings. And you have here a quotation on the Americans, where Darwin says that, in fact, probably the success of the American population is a good example of natural selection. So you see, probably it would have been possible to speak about Australians, I guess, but the idea is that its new nations have been somehow a selection of the best people, the most active people, and it explains the success of these new countries. And the consequence of that is that it was also difficult for Darwin not to accept that the disappearance of some population was in fact natural. It was a consequence of this mechanism of evolution by natural selection. And you have here a quotation from Darwin concerning the population of New Zealand, the Maoris. And you can read this quotation, which is somehow difficult, I guess, to read today. Ethically, we do not accept today such a text, considering that disappearance of some human population is somehow a natural fact, a result of natural selection between human groups. Well, I don't want to tell that Darwin was a racist. It was not true. Darwin was far less racist than people of his time. He was against slavery. He was a liberal compared to many other people. But I think it's simply to show you that he was a man who introduced the human beings into nature and the evolution of human beings into the general evolution of organisms. It was difficult for Darwin to admit that with the appearance of human beings, the things had become totally different and that natural selection was no longer active in human population. So it was a difficulty. So just now, turn to my conclusions. And why is it important to read a book on the origin of species? I have tried to show you the reason. It's a very rich book with many scientific, interesting information in this book. It's important to read this book because it's an honest book. Darwin does not hide the difficulties of his model and theories, the lack of information, the lack of proofs concerning many facts. He really admits all of that. So it's a very honest book. It's also a book which shows you how scientific knowledge progresses. It's science in progress. Darwin is still hesitating. In some pages, he privileged one mechanism. In others, he privileged another mechanism. Darwin is really showing you how scientific work progresses. It's not a book telling what is truth. It's a book where Darwin really tries to go ahead and to have the best possible theory to explain the facts. And also another characteristic of Darwin is that Darwin does not exclude. He considers that some mechanisms are more important, but he does not see the reason why he would exclude other mechanisms if he has no arguments to exclude them. So, for instance, he considered that big leaps in evolution might have occurred. He had no argument to absolutely say this kind of mechanism has not played any role. So Darwin admits that while he has no right to exclude some mechanism, and in his book you can see this attitude, which I think is quite rare many times among scientists who prefer to adopt one point of view and exclude all the other point of view. It's not the case of Darwin. And finally, also, Darwin was a true naturalist. As I mentioned, he did a lot of work on different questions. And it's important because we commemorate Darwin this year, scientists or biologists. But now we are in a time where we are specialized. Some biologists study functional biology, molecular biology, some other cell biology, some other evolutionary biology. It would be very difficult today to have a work similar to Darwin's work with such a big vision of the biological facts. And I think it's somehow a challenge for us. Darwin probably, it would not have been possible for Darwin to work today. Even at the time of Darwin, many biologists told him, you are not specialized, you are not enough specialized, you must work on one unique question. Don't work on so many different questions. So imagine what it is today when you have this high specialization in science. And just to end, a last quotation of Darwin about the expression natural selection, which you know it maybe is not the best expression, but you have a very interesting justification of the expression by Darwin, which shows you, I think, the very smart mind of Darwin. And it's interesting because he says people tell that natural selection is not the best adapted expression, but chemists speak about affinity, physicists speak about attraction. These words are not perfect also. Nevertheless, they are doing good science. So one can do good science with the notion of natural selection, which probably was not the best expression. So now we have time for discussion.
Thank you.